Greetings, everybody. I guess the best way to start is to talk about how I think about research in terms of research at the margins, right? So when people are trained as traditional researchers, you're always asked about data, site, participants, and the like, right? I often think of that as part of the larger colonial project, right? So if I'm thinking about a process that is attempting to decolonize that, if I'm looking at Linda Tuiwai Smith, who talks about what does it mean to talk with people and engage with folks, not because of a personal investment, but because of an investment beyond yourself, right? So if I think about research in that way, I'm thinking about an investment beyond, and not to use financial terminology, but this commitment beyond oneself, beyond what is written down, beyond what is delivered to academic journals, beyond what is becomes a book manuscript, right? So any of those things I just view as documentation and reference, right? So this thing around reference for people who are interested in similar work, so they could actually riff off of it and do something else, and not rip, but riff like a jazz riff in terms of actually use it in other directions, take it in other directions, challenge it, but really to push this paradigm around challenging research for the sake of research. Because research in communities has this traditional colonial relationship. Communities have been castigated, maligned, pathologized, it's another good word, perpetually isolated and used as unwilling lab rats in cages, right? So this thing around, so if we know that to be true, what are we doing to actively interrupt that, right? And does our work actively interrupt that? Or do we need to speak more into the contradictions as to how our work is complicit in that, right? Because journal articles will ask you in your review, well, where is the data, right? Who are you talking to? Who were your participants? So this thing around reframing it, right? So when you have to reframe, and this is a colleague of mine always says, we have to engage in a trilingualism, right? So the trilingualism is, what are you trying to say? What are the constraints, the mainstream constraints? And then how are you trying to do it, right? So thinking about that in very explicit ways in terms of research that is centered in justice as determined by the people we're working with, right? So that thing around a justice, so because a lot of times, we get inundated with this language around social justice, but we've never really interrogated what it means, right? So, because a lot of times when you're talking about justice, you're really in spaces where you are challenged around the contradictions in the spaces that you occupy as a college professor and researcher, right? So if we're not willing to challenge those things, then I don't know if that ever leans towards this larger arc of justice, right? And justice being determined by the communities and people who are experiencing the injustice. So I think about, that's where I situate my work, and it's manifested itself in a number of different ways, but I try to operate from that perspective because I am very clear of the results of the colonial project of academic research in particularly communities of color in urban space. So in recognition of that, what do I do differently, and how do I actually lean on the universe of other folks who have been doing this well before me, right? So that's how I frame and have been framing my work over the last 20 years now in terms of work that I've been doing. So I guess it's probably best to stop there and kind of engage your questions, because I think those are more important than me engaging you all with verbal diarrhea, right? Mm-hmm. And our Ferris Bueller moment. Right? I always worry about that. I mean, I always worry about that. Is what I'm saying that discerning or that clear, right? Probably none of the above, right? So that, so anybody feel free to start.
I think I want to know a little bit more about trilingualism. And I think as a graduate student, we're in a world where we're always worried we're going to do it wrong, right? Because there is this process of this is how you do research. And when you're pushing back on that because of the communities where you're from or the communities you're working with, you're under this constant, like, I may be doing it wrong. So, and also things that are expected of you as publications, going through prelims, and getting out on the other side, right? And so yeah, how have you learned to do trilingualism? What's your advice for those of us that are thinking that this is really important in our work, but sometimes struggle to find that?
Thank you for that, because I think that's really where the rubber hits the road, right? So this thing around, you're always oscillating between the conventions of the assignment of completing the dissertation, right? And that's a set of assignments, right? So your qualifying exam, your proposal, and then the actual defense, right? So if you think about those things, right? Think about them as temporary developments, right? So it's that thing around, and still in that space, you don't have to compromise the integrity of the work that it is that you do, because a lot of times, and I'll let the secret out on camera, right? Academics do this thing where if they don't understand the work, they try to say that it doesn't exist, right? So that's the thing. But who does this work? Which really means I haven't read shit, right? So that thing around really challenging that and saying there's a universe of people who are doing this work in this way that challenge those conventions, right? So, for example, Abby Lincoln, Linda Toohey Smith, and Norm Denson have just come out with this handbook of indigenous methodologies, right? You know, it's this encyclopedic thing, right? So put that on somebody's table and say, well, yeah, there's a whole universe of people who are doing this work. Because the thing is, don't think about this as work on its own. It works, it just sits as on its lonesome. Think about your work as in conversation with the universe of work that exists, right? So that way you're not speaking in a vacuum, right? Which some folks who are fearful of this new thing will tell you, right? So this thing around really thinking about that, and only think about the conventions of the so I'd use the prelims for the qualifying exams, for example, right? One of the ways to get through that convention is to think about, do not veer from the question, right? Whatever question is put forward, go into that question, go deep into that question. Do not use tangents, right? There are no space for tangents in your qualifying exams, right? When it comes to the proposal, what is this thing? What is the body of literature and that's your statement of purpose, chapter 1. Lit review, what is the universe of people who have actually talked about this thing historically and contemporarily? Method, how are you trying to engage the work, right? And then that way, you don't have to, in that trilingualism, you're actually bringing in that universe of people who have actually started to do this work. So the depth of your conversation becomes important in those conventions, right? So now you know that to be true. Once you start the dissertation and you let the data inform your work and you actually have your own commentary around that work, be prepared to stand on that, right? I mean, this defense is temporary, right? And a lot of times this stuff, and I'll say this on camera too, a lot of this becomes revenge of the nerds, right? So, you get into this thing and people just want to genuflect off of each other and nobody really knows shit, right? But this thing around, who are the people who are supportive of your work? And even if they don't understand it, they're willing to support you in the conversation with this other work, right? So in that trilingualism, really being versed with how your stuff speaks to the universe, is in conversation with this universe of work that is similar, right? And being willing to say where it departs from it, right? And why it departs, right? So this thing around really being, and this is the grounding of your work, right? Because a lot of times this is, everybody gets into this thing, well, what new, they always pressure you all as grad students. Well, what new are you bringing? What new discovery is here? Like, look, last time we checked, not too much new stuff happening, right? The newness of the piece is the particular instance in which you speak, right? That's the uniqueness of it, right? And the way in which you talk about that unique instance is the contribution, right? So this thing around being very clear about that, because you don't want to be in a space to compromise the integrity of what you're doing, so you now instruct grad students who are now under you to compromise their integrity in doing this type of work, right? Now, people would say that that's imbued in oppositional defiant disorder, but no, I'm willing to take that, because the people's work that we respect and actually gravitate towards, they don't even read education stuff, right? They're entirely outside of the discipline, right? And bringing things in to spaces where you actually are engaging from a different space, right? Because that's another contribution, right? So being willing to say those things around where is the conversation congealing and where are the departures, right? I think those are important things to talk about, those departures, right? Because this is, you can have also these folks advisors who just want you to reflect everything they've written for the last 30 years, which is trash, right? That's a bogus exercise, right? But this thing around who are the spaces that are supporting you in this conversation? The next thing with that, understanding that those spaces are not as large as you may think, right? I think that's critical, right? Do not expect the parade, right, of people marching in lockstep with your work. It'll only be a few folks, but that's okay, right? You still have the universe in which you're speaking to this group of folks. Yeah. I apologize for that elongated answer. Yeah.
Actually, I'm really interested in conversation with the universe. But as you mentioned, there are many of the colonial projects. If you go to the conference, even if you meet your colleagues, there are so many colonial projects. How do you engage with those things? And I don't want to be the furious grad student.
Right. And you don't have to be, and you can do it. Connie and myself work with a colleague by the name of Beth Ritchie, right? Beth Ritchie has the most beautiful and sanguine way to say "fuck you," right? I mean, it's beautiful to watch, right? So don't think about it as you having to be the rabble rouser with the AR-15 on the table saying which one of y'all want to jump, right? But this thing around saying, well, there's some problems here, right? And I want to engage those contradictions, right? And engaging those contradictions, I can speak to folks like Eve Tuck, Chris Hale, Linda Ozawa Bay, all these folks who are saying, this colonial, Linda Tui Y. Smith, right? Julia Sudbury, who actually uses another name now. But these things that actually trouble the work, all right? And saying it, Kevin Kumashiro, right? So intentionally saying, I want to trouble this work, because if we continue down this road, we will do the same things to communities that operate towards their detriment, right? And being prepared to stand alone with that. But remember, when you make that mark, standing alone is just that brief second. I promise you this will happen. Somebody will come to you, this has probably already happened. People will come up to you after the presentation and say, wow, I really like what you had to say. Thank you for saying that, right? Right, so that's affirmation to the universe that you're not on this island by yourself, despite what the research community will say about this, right? Because that's a thing around really having that challenge, and not the challenge just being wonton, right? It's not just you just rattling off at the mouth, but to say there are some deep and ingrained contradictions that we need to step into, right? That there are some spaces that we cannot be dismissive of in terms of what we occupy as graduate students, as new faculty members, or senior folks, right? So these things have to be, and they always have to be in question, when we engage our work, right? And we're not shunning away from that, right? We're very intentional about being very intentional about that space, because that, and it does another thing. So I always think about this. My background is actually, before school-based stuff, my background is in youth work. So this thing around using an organizing tactic to see who's really checking for what it is that you're saying, right? Because once you say those things, and this is kind of a conversation, again, that me and Connie have been having, once you do this type of work, the folks you need will show their faces. But we have to pay attention to when they show their faces. Right?
And when they should ask.
Right, exactly. Right? right. Just the real talk of it, right? So I think those things around really stepping out on faith in that instance, but I promise it will be very quick. And then other folks, it might even change some of your panelists, right? Some of your panelists might be like, damn, I need to rethink what I'm doing, right? So those things around pushing on the work in ways that are necessary, right? Especially in this kind of neoliberal explosion of everything, right? The privatization of everything. You all, they fashion you all as graduate students to be the entrepreneurial grad student, right? And all this business, right? So to really kind of push back on that and say, well, I don't know what that's really doing for the people that we care about.
So one of the things that, in looking you up and doing research into what you do, and one of the things that I admired most when I looked at it is the work you do both in academia and in schools themselves, as a teacher in a high school. Because one of the things that I ran into when I first became a grad student was, like, I don't know that I want to do that academia grind. Like, I don't want to produce papers for the sake of papers, and that's not what all professors do. But it comes across strong that way when you first walk in the door. And like, I got into this because I want to work with the communities that I came from. I want to serve them in a way that works for them, not just print papers for the sake of making someone think, like affirming for someone else that what I'm doing is justified. So what are some of the things some of the struggles and some of the victories that you see in doing that kind of work where you're straddling that line of academia and working on the ground in schools?
One, I think in terms of the victories, if we can call them those, right? I think one of the things is that you are always grounded, right? When you're working with high schoolers, they do not care if you have a PhD, right? It's like, what are you going to do right now, homie? I don't care. That's real cute. That's real cute that you got a PhD, but shit is happening, right? Let's start there, right? So it always keeps me grounded. Another thing is each space informs the other, right? So the high school space informs the undergrad space, which informs the PhD space and the master's space, and vice versa, right? So all of those integrated spaces. The other thing is, this is kind of Frank Moten and Stefano Harney had this book called The Undercommons. Right, and I love this chapter that they have in it. They say, our only relationship to the university should be a criminal one. Right? And it's them being polemic, right? Because they're anarchists and they write, it's wild to see that chapter by two dudes who got six-figure salaries, right? This is really interesting. Talk about a contradiction, right? But they position it in what they call fugitive space, right? And that's the premise of the book, this kind of fugitive commons, right? So in fugitive space, the idea is understanding that we are all under some form of occupation and surveillance. If we understand that to be true, then where are the spaces where we can do the work that matters to folk according to the folks that we're working with, right? And always asking that question, right? So we always have to return to that space. Now, the challenges in that, one, folks don't think it's research. Two, people will, I just got called this over email yesterday, ideologue. I don't know, whatever, right? So you get, it kind of gets into this strange name calling, right? Then it gets into this thing around only certain people can do this type of work. So it's not good to train them in this way, right? So that's always a conundrum, right? That comes with the territory. I had the gift of being working under a guy named James Anderson, right? Who would always say, look, if you're gonna try to do this work, you need to be very clear about this work, and you need to have accountability to the folks that you're working with at all times, right? So those things, I think, really become important, right? And that's you, going back to the earlier question, that's you pushing back on this traditional colonial paradigm of what counts as research, right? And really using, that's where the philosophers are very useful in this, right? So I use a guy named Charles Mills who talks about a racial contract, right? So how do we now start to think about this racial contract, right? How are people racialized, and in their racialization, how are the intersections of class, gender, sexual identity, and orientation now engaged in this, right? What don't we know and what do we need to know, right? So this is kind of me right now learning a lot from the transgender community in terms of what slow work really is, right? So thinking about what Dean Spade talks about, and slow work being not necessarily the pace is slow, but the commitment is to be very serious about our reflections. Or Frank Wilderson, who talks about we need to be in the process of thinking about thinking, right? When I heard that, I was like, whoa, damn, what the fuck? Like, you know what I mean? But think, and the way he says it, right? So he says we need to think about thinking so we cannot be deterred with whatever it is that we decide to do, right? And I thought that's a heavy contribution, right? Because if you're clear about what it is, anything that comes to you, you can just say, oh, that's nice and that's important, but that mitigates what it is that I'm trying to do at this moment, right? So, and being willing to learn from folks who are new to the space, but incorporate different spaces and have different experiences, right? So when me and Connie are talking, and she's putting me up on Wilderson, Joy James, Sadia Hartman, all these folks, and I'm saying to myself, damn, you know, I go back to the house and I'm like, damn, I got a whole bunch of shit to do. I got to get my mind right? But this thing around really understanding that, because these are the spaces that contribute to our work in a different way, and always being, I guess the other part of that, the last part of that is suspending expertise, right? Just because you wrote a long paper about a little thing does not necessarily make you an expert, right? Because there are young folks, 30 young folks that I got in a African American and Latino studies class who I would refer to as experts on their lives, right? But are very rarely given credit as such, right? So this thing around what are the lenses by which we use to make this more salient. So those things, those affirmations are often few and far between, so we have to use them as reminders as why, right? So you all as a graduate cohort, there was a philosopher who was in my program by the name of Ralph Page, and he told us in a pro seminar, he said, look, you're gonna need those and those like you to affirm your sanity. And I was like, damn, right? And I didn't realize until much later how true that was, right? And those spaces, and that's why we always have to be open to see folk when they do show their faces, right? Because in some cases, we may assume the enemy, right? And those folks might be willing to ride for us and support us in ways that the people that we expected to support us would not, right? So we always have to be open for those spaces. Always worried, it's like, if people are saying in their heads, what the fuck? Well, I guess one way to get some thoughts from you all. I mean, are there things that you all are experiencing now that you all are having issue with or concern with or trying to grapple with?
I'll be selfish because the space is open. So one of the things that I'm grappling with now is, and it's with my research, and I was talking to Connie a little bit about yesterday, is I want to look at the new behavior plans that are being rolled out, specifically positive behavior interventions and restorative justice in particular, because they've done something along those lines here in the schools. But the integrity of how it's being rolled out and the resistance that pops up against it, and part of what I want to do is use a critical race theory lens with regards to that work because of how I see the resistance pop up. But I worry that I worry all the time that I'm looking for a gotcha moment. Like, I found the racism. There it is. And I worry all the time about that because that's not what it's about. And like that doesn't help what's going on in the schools. Like just pointing a finger at it, yeah, we know Madison has racist issues. And that doesn't do anything. So how do I transform that into a moment, into work that actually helps the community move past it to a place that actually helps them function and improve the quality of education for all the kids? Because that's really what it's about.
I would say, think about that reframing, right? And in the reframing, so is it really not to move past it? Because I think that's often the thing around when we talk about racism, we talk about white supremacy, it's always this thing around, can we get past that, right? And the issue is we've never got to it, right? So when we can actually get to it, and the data, so if you think about Madison in particular, and this is very interesting about Madison, so not towards the death by way of police violence of Brother Robinson, but to think about Madison in a particular way. As a capital city, there are more black people in real numbers in jail in Madison than there are in Milwaukee. In a city that's a third its size, right? In real numbers, right? So if we think about that in real time, now it's not about, and this kind of goes into the PBIS stuff, this kind of goes into the restorative and transformative justice stuff. So we have to ask a very fundamental and uneasy question. Is there something fundamentally and structurally wrong with youth of color in Madison schools? Or are we talking about a structural issue that has gone totally unaddressed? Right? That's the starting point, right? So now, if that's the starting point, how are those young folks viewed in school? Right? And is this, and Connie always reminds me of this, is this PBIS, is this restorative justice just another way to keep folks confined in a shithole? Right, but right. So that right. I always right. That's me paraphrasing, right? But are these things, right? So is PBIS to say, okay, it's really messed up, but just stick with us for a little bit. It's gonna be good, right? Or is restorative justice like, man, just hold on, young blood. You know, it's gonna be good, despite you're being dehumanized at every second in this place, right? Or do we have to rethink these places? Right? So instead of the restorative justice, what is the transformative justice? Right? So we were just at Insight Color of Violence, and folks were saying, well, look, what does it mean to engage in a transformative process, right? Not just this restorative piece, right? Because the restorative piece is just the inflicted and the inflictor and the inflicted upon engaging in some conciliatory peace, in opposed to what is the space that now allows us to engage what is happening here so we can actually reframe it, right? So is our transformative model really centered in anti-recidivism and, dare we say, prison abolition, right? And not as pejorative terms, but to really say, okay, here's the space where we now are actively working to eliminate the conditions that put our young folks in those spaces, right? To the extent that we can, because we're not with them in all these different spaces. But to the extent that we can, we want to eliminate those. We want to eliminate those conditions that further marginalize young folk in these spaces, right? And in order to do that, we need to recognize what is happening here, right? Because white supremacy is not individual white people, right? It is a structure that people agree upon that the castigation and subjugation and marginalizations of certain groups is normal, right, and good, right? And we have to start, that's the starting point, not because a lot of times we work those spaces, so PBIS and RJ come in a crisis moment, right? Or they call you, we just had a fight. Are you around? Right? That type of business, right? So this thing around saying, if we're gonna rethink this, if we're gonna reimagine this, then what we do on the ground may call us to challenge the quote unquote interventions that we've put forward, right? In real ways, but not just the challenge. Now, what are we doing, right? So what is the radical imaginary on the ground? Right, this is kind of what James Baldwin, Sean Jenwright talk about, right? So what is this radical imaginary on the ground, right? And how does that get us into even more contradictions, right? So this thing around really talking about that. And then always, I think, in your work also, because you're going to be working with a number of different spaces, being able to articulate what it is that you're talking about to people outside of the quote unquote research community. Right? A good friend of mine, Crystal Lauer, who's a beautiful writer, right? She always talks about the gift, she calls it the gift of ordinary language, right? So this thing around, some folks may refer to that as deconstruction, right? Or however we want to frame that. But this thing around being able to articulate that for the purposes of it being used, challenged, and engaged at a number of different levels.
Sorry.
Keep going.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank y'all so much. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And let's say we'll get a time to get up over the next day and a half, I guess, to get into this a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Come for the topic.
Yeah.